The morning Josephine Voss arrived in Bodie, California, 3 men died in a mining accident before noon, and by sunset, the saloon had burned to the ground. It was July 1878, and the high desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of the gold mining town. Josephine stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the clothes on her back. She was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. She had come west to escape whispers back in Missouri, whispers that followed her like shadows. Bad luck, they said. Cursed, they claimed. Every place she stayed, misfortune seemed to follow. The stagecoach driver had barely touched her bag when his hand slipped, and the luggage tumbled into the street, bursting open and scattering her few possessions across the dirt. He muttered an apology, but she saw the way his eyes narrowed when the news came running down the street about the mine collapse. 3 good men trapped under a ton of rock and timber. The driver's face went pale, and he looked at Josephine like she had brought death itself to town. She gathered her belongings with trembling hands, trying to ignore the stares from the townspeople who had gathered. A woman in a blue calico dress pulled her children close and hurried them across the street. A shopkeeper stepped back into his doorway, making a subtle sign against evil. Josephine had seen it all before. In St. Louis, the boarding house where she worked had flooded the week she arrived. In Independence, a fever swept through town days after she took a job at the general store. Never mind that floods happened every spring or that disease was common in crowded settlements. People needed someone to blame, and a woman alone, with no family and no history, made an easy target. She found a small boarding house at the edge of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who had seen enough hardship in her own life to not judge others too quickly. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the mountains rising in the distance. "You pay weekly in advance," Mrs. Chen said, her accent thick but her English clear. "No men in rooms, no loud noise. You keep clean." Josephine paid for 2 weeks from the small amount of money she had saved. It would have to last until she found work, though she doubted anyone in Bodie would hire her once word spread. Word spread faster than she expected. By the second day, the saloon fire had been connected to her arrival. Never mind that the owner had been careless with lamp oil for months. Never mind that half the buildings in Bodie were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. She was the stranger, the outsider, the woman who appeared just as disaster struck. Josephine tried 3 different establishments looking for work. The general store owner took one look at her and said his position had just been filled. The hotel manager claimed he could not afford extra help. Even the laundry, which was desperate for workers, turned her away after an older woman whispered something to the proprietor. She stood in the middle of the street that afternoon, the July heat making her dizzy, wondering if she should just leave. Maybe go to Sacramento or San Francisco, where she could disappear into the crowds. But the stagecoach fare would take most of her remaining money, and she would arrive in a new city with nothing. That was when she saw him. He stood a head taller than any man on the street, with shoulders broad enough to block the sun. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, and his face was weathered from years in the elements. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt, despite the heat, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. When he moved through the crowd toward the general store, people stepped aside without thinking, the way they might for a bear come down from the mountains. Josephine found herself staring, and when his eyes met hers across the dusty street, she felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were a startling blue, pale as mountain ice, and they held hers for a long moment before he nodded slightly and continued on his way. "That is Marcus Nash," Mrs. Chen said that evening over a simple dinner of rice and vegetables. "Mountain man. Trapper. He comes to town maybe 4 times each year for supplies. Lives up in the high country. People say he is dangerous, but he never causes trouble." "Does he work the mines?" Josephine asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "He hunts, traps beaver and fox, sells the pelts. Sometimes he guides people through the mountains, but mostly he keeps to himself. His family had land up there before he was born. His father was a trapper too." Josephine thought about those blue eyes and wondered what would make a man choose such a solitary life. She found out sooner than she expected. The next morning, she was walking back from another fruitless job search when she heard shouting from the other side of the street. A group of men had gathered, and they were looking at her with expressions that made her stomach clench with fear. "This has gone too far," one of them called out. He was a thick-set man with a red face and mean eyes. "Since you showed up, we have had nothing but trouble. First the mine, then the fire, and now Tom Bradley's boy has taken sick with fever." "I had nothing to do with any of that," Josephine said, forcing her voice to stay steady even though her heart was pounding. "I am just trying to find honest work." "Honest work?" The red-faced man spat into the dirt. "You are a curse, woman. Everyone knows it. You need to leave Bodie before you bring more disaster down on us." Other men were gathering now, and Josephine saw faces she recognized from the stores that had turned her away. Fear was turning to anger in their eyes, the kind of anger that could turn a crowd into a mob. "The lady stays." The voice came from behind the crowd, deep and calm as a mountain lake. The men turned, and Josephine saw Marcus Nash standing there with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He did not look angry or threatening, but something in his stillness made the crowd hesitate. "This is not your concern, Nash," the red-faced man said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I am making it my concern." Marcus stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him like water around a stone. "You men want to blame someone for bad luck. How about you blame Wilson for running a shoddy mine operation and cutting corners on safety? Or blame Hackett for keeping lamp oil right next to his stove? Or maybe consider that children get sick sometimes, and it has nothing to do with a woman minding her own business." "You do not know what she is," another man protested. "Bad luck follows her. Then I guess I will take my chances." Marcus looked at Josephine, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been understanding. "Miss, you need work," she nodded, not trusting her voice. "I am headed back to my cabin tomorrow. I need someone who can cook, mend, and help with preserving meat and preparing pelts. The work is hard, the cabin is remote, and the pay is not much, but you will have a roof over your head and food in your belly. Interested?" Josephine knew what the townspeople would say. A young, unmarried woman going off alone with a mountain man. But as she looked at the angry faces surrounding her and then at Marcus Nash's steady gaze, the choice seemed clear. "Yes," she said, "I am interested." The red-faced man started to protest, but Marcus cut him off with a look. "Anyone here have a problem with me hiring help for my own cabin on my own land?" No one spoke. Whatever reputation Marcus Nash had in Bodie, it was enough to keep the mob at bay. "Pack your things," Marcus said to Josephine. "We leave at dawn." That night, Josephine lay in her narrow bed and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. She knew nothing about Marcus Nash except that he was a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. He could be dangerous. He could be cruel. But when she closed her eyes, she saw those pale blue eyes looking at her without fear or suspicion, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. Mrs. Chen helped her pack in the morning, adding extra supplies without being asked. "You are a good girl," the older woman said quietly. Do not let them make you believe otherwise. And Marcus Nash, he is a good man too, lonely but good. Marcus was waiting with 2 horses when Josephine stepped outside just after sunrise. One was a massive roan gelding that suited his size, and the other was a smaller mare with gentle eyes. You ride? He asked. Some, Josephine admitted. It has been a while. We have a long way to go, 6 hours up the mountain trail. Let me know if you need to rest. He helped her mount, and his hands on her waist were gentle despite their obvious strength. She could feel the solid muscle in his arms and shoulders, the power held carefully in check. When he swung up onto his own horse, the animal barely shifted under his weight, used to carrying such a large rider. They rode out of Bodie as the sun climbed higher, and Josephine did not look back. The trail wound up into the Sierra Nevada, climbing through scrub and pine toward the high country. Marcus set an easy pace, stopping twice to let the horses rest and drink from clear mountain streams. He did not talk much, but his silence was comfortable rather than hostile. When he did speak, it was to point out landmarks or warn her about a difficult section of trail ahead. Why did you help me? Josephine finally asked as they paused near a grove of aspen trees. You do not even know me. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant peaks. I know what it is like to be blamed for things you cannot control, he said finally. My mother was Shoshone. My father was a white trapper who loved her and married her proper, but plenty of folks had opinions about that. When I was growing up, anytime something went wrong, there were people who looked at me and saw a half-breed bringing trouble. Did not matter what the truth was. Josephine felt her throat tighten. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. It taught me to judge people for myself, not by what others say. He looked at her then, and she saw understanding in his eyes. You get that hunted look when people stare at you. I recognize it. They rode on as the sun climbed higher. The air grew thinner and cooler as they ascended, and Josephine found herself breathing hard. Marcus noticed and called another rest stop, handing her a canteen of water. Takes time to adjust to the altitude, he said. We are almost there. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a rise, tucked into a small valley with a stream running alongside it. It was larger than Josephine had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it stood a sturdy barn and several smaller outbuildings. Your father built this? She asked. Marcus nodded. He and my mother, I have added to it over the years. The barn is new, and that building there is for storing and working the pelts. He helped her down from the horse, and she felt how tired she was from the long ride. Her legs were shaky, and when she stumbled, his hand caught her elbow to steady her. Come on, he said. I will show you inside, and then you can rest while I tend the horses. The cabin's interior was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's home. The main room held a large fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and shelves lined with supplies and equipment. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above, and a door opened to what looked like a small bedroom on the ground floor. You can take the bedroom, Marcus said. I sleep in the loft anyway, warmer in winter with the heat rising. I cannot take your room, Josephine protested. It is not a request. You are working for me, and part of the wages is room and board. The bedroom is part of that. His tone left no room for argument, though it was not unkind. Josephine looked around the cabin that would be her home for who knew how long and felt an unexpected sense of peace. It was isolated, yes, but it was also beautiful. Through the window she could see meadows filled with wildflowers and mountains rising against a perfect blue sky. Thank you, she said quietly, for all of this. Marcus shrugged his broad shoulders. Do not thank me yet. You have not seen how much work there is to do. He was not exaggerating. Over the next few days, Josephine learned that keeping a mountain homestead running was backbreaking labor. There was washing to do in the cold stream, food to prepare and preserve, a garden to tend, pelts to scrape and stretch, meat to smoke and salt, bread to bake, and 100 other tasks that filled every daylight hour. But Marcus worked just as hard as she did, and usually harder. She would wake before dawn to find him already out checking his trap lines or chopping wood. He hunted several times a week, bringing back deer and elk that he butchered with practiced efficiency. When something needed repair, he fixed it. When winter supplies needed gathering, he gathered them. And he never once made her feel like the work she did was less important than his. "These socks you mended are better than when they were new," he said one evening, examining a pair she had darned. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" "My mother taught me before she died," Josephine said. She was a seamstress in Philadelphia. "We moved west after my father passed, but she got sick on the journey. I was 16. Marcus looked at her with something like sympathy. "That is young to be on your own. I managed, worked where I could, moved when I had to." She did not mention the string of disasters that seemed to follow her, but she suspected he understood anyway. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. Josephine rose early to start breakfast while Marcus went to check his traps. They ate together at the rough wooden table, and then each went about their separate tasks. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Josephine found herself watching Marcus when she thought he was not looking. The way his muscles flexed when he split wood, the careful gentleness with which he handled injured animals, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. He was unlike any man she had ever known, completely comfortable in his own skin and his solitary life. But she noticed things that suggested he was not as solitary as he pretended. He had books, good ones, and she sometimes saw him reading by lamplight. He played a harmonica with surprising skill. And he talked to the horses, and the few chickens he kept with an easy affection that spoke of loneliness. August turned to September, and the nights grew cooler. Marcus began preparing in earnest for winter, cutting and stacking enormous amounts of firewood, hunting and preserving as much meat as possible, checking and rechecking the barn and cabin for any weakness that might let in the cold. "Winter up here is no joke," he told Josephine. "We can get snowed in for weeks at a time. Once the heavy snows start, we will not be able to get down the mountain until spring." "Have you ever been trapped all winter?" she asked. "Every winter. That is the trade-off for living up here. But I have enough supplies, and now with you helping, we have even more put by." The casual way he included her in his plans for winter made something warm bloom in Josephine's chest. She had been with him for 2 months now, and not once had he suggested that she should leave or that the arrangement was temporary. It was as if he had simply accepted her presence as a permanent part of his life. She realized she felt the same way. The idea of leaving the cabin, of going back down to the towns and the whispers and the accusations, made her chest tighten with anxiety. Here in the mountains with Marcus, she felt safe for the first time in years. But she was also aware of other feelings growing, feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. The sight of Marcus stripped to the waist while working in the September heat made her mouth go dry. The accidental brush of his hand against hers, when they both reached for something sent electricity through her skin. And at night, alone in her room, she found herself thinking about what it might feel like to be held in those strong arms, to feel those calloused hands gentle on her skin. She told herself it was foolish. Marcus had hired her to work, nothing more. He treated her with respect and kindness, but he had given no indication that he thought of her as anything other than an employee. And she had no business entertaining romantic thoughts about a man who had shown her nothing but decency when she desperately needed it. But her heart did not seem to care about logic. The first real sign that Marcus might feel something more came on a cool evening in late September. Josephine had made venison stew for dinner, and they were eating on the porch, watching the stars come out. "You ever think about going back down to Bodie?" Marcus asked suddenly. Finding a different situation, Josephine's heart sank. Was he trying to tell her to leave? "Do you want me to go?" "No." The word came out quickly, almost forcefully. "No, I just wondered if you were happy here. It is a hard life, and you are used to towns and people." "I am happier here than I have been anywhere," Josephine said honestly. "If you are satisfied with my work, I would like to stay. For as long as you will have me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I am more than satisfied. I just want to make sure you are not staying because you feel like you have no other choice. I am staying because I want to be here." She met his eyes in the starlight. "You have been kinder to me than anyone has in years. You see me as a person, not a curse or a burden. That means more than I can say." "You are not a curse, Josephine." The way he said her name made her shiver. "You are one of the hardest working people I have ever met, and you have made this place feel like a home instead of just somewhere I survive between trap lines." They looked at each other across the small table, and Josephine felt the air between them change, becoming charged with possibility. Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered on her cheek, rough and warm. "I should not," he said quietly. "You work for me. It would not be right to press my advantage. What if I wanted you to?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's eyes darkened, and his hand cupped her face more fully. "Do not say things like that unless you mean them." "I mean them." He stood slowly and moved around the table, pulling her gently to her feet. He was so much bigger than her, his broad shoulders blocking out the stars, but she felt no fear. When he lowered his head and kissed her, it was gentle despite the obvious hunger she could feel in the tension of his body. Josephine melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The muscles under her palms were rock solid, and when he pulled her closer, she felt the carefully controlled strength in him. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was something to be treasured rather than feared. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the day I saw you standing in that street looking lost and defiant at the same time," he admitted. "I have wanted you to do that for almost as long," Josephine said. "This changes things," Marcus said. "I cannot be your employer and court you properly at the same time." Josephine felt a moment of panic. "Please do not send me away." "I am not sending you anywhere." He pulled back enough to look at her seriously. "I am saying you are not my employee anymore. You are my partner in this homestead if you want to be, equal shares in everything, and I would like permission to court you properly." "We are alone on a mountain," Josephine pointed out, trying not to smile. "How exactly does one court properly up here?" "I have no idea," Marcus admitted. "I have never courted anyone before, but I will figure it out because you deserve to be treated right." Over the next weeks, Marcus did figure it out in his own way. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows. He played his harmonica in the evenings, learning songs he thought she might like. He taught her to shoot and to track, skills he said she needed to know for living in the mountains. And every evening they sat close together on the porch, talking about everything and nothing, stealing kisses under the stars. Josephine fell more in love with him every day. She loved his quiet strength and his gentle hands. She loved the way he talked to animals and read poetry when he thought she was not listening. She loved how he never made her feel weak or incapable, but also never hesitated to help with heavy work. He was everything she had never dared to hope for in a man. October brought the first real snowfall, and Marcus's preparations proved their worth. The cabin stayed warm and dry, and their stores of food were more than adequate. They spent the long evenings inside, cooking together, reading aloud to each other, and gradually exploring the growing passion between them with the understanding that they both wanted this to mean something permanent. "Marry me," Marcus said one night as they sat by the fire. It was not a question, but it was not quite a command either. Josephine looked at him, this mountain man who had defended her against a mob and given her a home and showed her what it meant to be loved without conditions. "Yes. We will have to wait until spring to get down to Bodie for a proper preacher," Marcus said. "Unless you want to wait longer, have a real wedding with guests and such." "I do not need guests," Josephine said. "I just need you and someone to speak the words that make it legal." Marcus pulled her into his lap and she curled against his broad chest, feeling safe and loved and home. "You know what they will say in Bodie," he said quietly, "about you bringing bad luck. Let them say what they want." Josephine tilted her head back to look at him. "You told them I brought you the best luck, and you were right. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," Marcus said, and kissed her with a thoroughness that left no doubt about his feelings. The winter was long and harsh, with snow piling high around the cabin and temperatures dropping far below freezing. But inside, Josephine had never been warmer. She and Marcus spent the months growing even closer, learning each other's habits and quirks, sharing work and meals and the long nights. When Marcus finally made love to her on a night when the wind howled outside but the cabin was warm and safe, it was everything she had dreamed. He was gentle with his strength, worshipful with his hands and mouth, and afterward held her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I should have said it before, but I love you more than I knew I could love anyone." "I love you too," Josephine whispered back and felt tears of happiness slide down her cheeks. Spring came slowly to the high country, but by late April the snow had melted enough to make the trail down to Bodie passable. Marcus and Josephine rode down together on a bright morning, her sitting behind him on the big roan with her arms wrapped around his waist. They went straight to the church and found the circuit preacher who happened to be in town. Reverend Matthews was an old man who had seen enough of life to not judge too harshly. "You two want to be married?" he asked, looking them over. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "As soon as possible." "You got witnesses?" Mrs. Chen had been their first stop and she stood up immediately. "I will witness. They are good people." To everyone's surprise, the blacksmith also stood up. "I will witness too. Nash helped me out last winter, gave me elk meat when my family was hungry. I owe him." The ceremony was simple and brief, but when Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, Josephine felt a joy so fierce it took her breath away. Marcus kissed her in front of the small congregation, and she did not care who was watching or what they thought. Outside the church, they found a small crowd had gathered. The red-faced man who had confronted Josephine months ago was there, and he stepped forward with an uncomfortable expression. "Nash, Mrs. Nash," he said, addressing Josephine by her new title. "I owe you an apology, madam. We were wrong about you bringing bad luck. Since you left, we have had our share of troubles same as always, and we have had our share of good fortune too. It was not you. It was never you." "Thank you," Josephine said quietly. Other townspeople came forward with similar sentiments, and while Josephine appreciated the apologies, she found she did not care as much as she once would have. Their opinions no longer had power over her. They stayed in Bodie for 2 days, buying supplies and selling the pelts Marcus had accumulated over the winter. The prices were good, and they returned to the mountain with full saddlebags and lighter hearts. Summer in the high country was glorious. Josephine and Marcus worked side by side through the long days, but the work felt different now that they were truly partners in every sense. They laughed more, touched more, stole moments of passion in the meadows and by the stream. In August, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She told Marcus one evening as they watched the sunset, her hand on her still flat belly. Marcus's face transformed with wonder and then worry. "We need to get you down to a town with a doctor." "Not yet," Josephine said. "I am healthy and strong. We have time. But maybe when it gets closer, we could go down to Carson City or even Sacramento, somewhere with a real hospital." "Whatever you need," Marcus said, his large hand covering hers on her belly. "I will take care of you, both of you." They made plans through the fall. Marcus wanted to move down to a town before the baby came, but Josephine convinced him that they could stay through early winter. She felt better in the mountains than she had anywhere else, and the peace of their isolated home felt important for the baby growing inside her. "Besides," she teased, "you would go crazy living in a town full-time." "I would go anywhere for you," Marcus said seriously. "You and this baby are my whole world." In November, with the first heavy snows threatening, they packed up and made the journey down to Carson City. Marcus had sold enough pelts over the years to have a substantial amount of money saved, and he rented a small house on the edge of town where they could stay until after the baby was born. Carson City was bigger than Bodie and more civilized. They found a doctor who assured them that Josephine was healthy and the baby was growing well. Marcus found work as a smithy's assistant, using his strength for honest wages, though Josephine could see he missed the mountains. "It is just for a few months," she assured him. "Once the baby is old enough to travel, we will go back home." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1879. The labor was long and difficult, and Marcus nearly wore a hole in the floor with his pacing. But when the doctor finally let him into the room and he saw Josephine holding their tiny son, tears streamed down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Marcus whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger. "You are perfect." They named him Michael Nash, and he had his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Marcus was besotted from the first moment, this huge mountain man reduced to happy foolishness by a 6-pound infant. "I never thought I would have this," he admitted to Josephine one night as they watched Michael sleep. "A family, a wife I love, a son. You did not bring me bad luck, Josephine. You brought me everything that matters." Josephine smiled and leaned against her husband's broad shoulder. "We brought each other the best luck." They stayed in Carson City through the winter and into early spring, giving Michael time to grow stronger. But by April, they were all eager to return to their mountain home. The journey was slower with a baby, but Michael was a good traveler, content in the sling Josephine wore against her chest. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, weathered but sound. Marcus spent the first weeks doing repairs and improvements, including building a cradle for Michael from smooth pine wood. Josephine settled back into the rhythms of mountain life, finding that even with a baby to care for, she loved the work and the peace. Michael grew strong and healthy in the mountain air. His first word was "da," which made Marcus grin for days. His first steps were taken on the porch, with both parents watching anxiously. And as he grew from baby to toddler, he showed signs of having both his father's strength and his mother's quick mind. Over the years, their family grew. A daughter came next, born in the cabin with Marcus attending and a doctor from Bodie riding up just in time to make sure everything went smoothly. They named her Julia, and she had Marcus's dark hair and Josephine's green eyes. 2 years later, another son arrived, named Thomas after Marcus's father. He was followed by another daughter, Sarah, who proved to be as fearless as her father and as stubborn as her mother. The cabin grew with the family. Marcus added rooms and a larger porch, built a better barn, and even constructed a small schoolhouse where Josephine taught the children to read and write. They made occasional trips down to Bodie or Carson City for supplies and to let the children see something of the wider world, but the mountain was their home. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Spring meant new births among the animals and gardens to plant. Summer brought long days of work and play. Fall meant harvesting and preparing for winter. And winter was a time for family, for sitting by the fire telling stories, for teaching the children everything they needed to know to survive in the mountains. Marcus aged well, his body staying strong from the constant physical labor, though silver began to thread through his dark hair. Josephine grew older too, but she remained healthy and vibrant, loved by her husband and children and content in the life they had built. Sometimes visitors would come up from Bodie, and occasionally someone would mention the old story about Josephine bringing bad luck. Marcus always had the same response. "My wife brought me the best luck I ever had," he would say, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. The day she came to Bodie was the day my life truly started. And Josephine, remembering that terrified young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach into a hostile town, would lean into her husband's strong embrace and silently agree. All the hardship, all the pain, all the years of being blamed for things beyond her control had led her here. To a mountain man who saw her for who she really was, to a love that had weathered every storm, to a family and a home and a life filled with joy. One evening when Josephine was in her 40s and Marcus was nearing 50, they sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the meadow below. Michael was 20 by then, a strong young man who had inherited his father's size and skill as a trapper. Julia was 18 and engaged to a good man from Carson City. Thomas was 16 and talking about becoming a doctor, and Sarah was 14 and already declaring she would never leave the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked, his hand finding Josephine's. "Staying up here instead of having an easier life in town." Josephine looked at her husband, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the man who had stood between her and a mob all those years ago and offered her not just safety but partnership and love. She looked at her children, healthy and happy and strong. She looked at the mountains rising against the evening sky and felt the peace that had settled into her bones over the years. "Not for a single moment," she said. "This is exactly where I was always meant to be." Marcus lifted her hand and kissed it, and they sat together as the stars began to appear, two people who had found in each other the home they had always been searching for. The years continued to unfold with the gentle inevitability of seasons. Michael eventually married a woman from Bodie, a strong-minded schoolteacher named Elizabeth who took to mountain life with surprising ease. They built their own cabin a few miles from Marcus and Josephine's homestead, close enough for family gatherings but far enough for independence. Their children, Marcus and Josephine's grandchildren, brought new life and laughter to the mountains. Julia married her Carson City man and moved to town, but she visited every summer with her growing family. Thomas did become a doctor, studying in Sacramento before returning to practice in Bodie, where he was known for riding up into the mountains to help anyone who needed medical care, regardless of their ability to pay. Sarah, true to her word, never left the mountains, though she did eventually marry a forest ranger and had children of her own. As Marcus and Josephine entered their 60s, they began to slow down, but only slightly. Marcus still ran his trap lines, though not as far or as often. Josephine still tended her garden and preserved food, though she had help now from daughters-in-law and grandchildren. The cabin that had once housed just Marcus had become the heart of a small mountain community, a place where family gathered and love multiplied. One spring morning, when the wildflowers were blooming and the stream was running high with snowmelt, Marcus and Josephine took a walk together through the meadows. It was something they had done countless times over the years, but it never lost its magic. "You remember the day we met?" Marcus asked, his hand warm in hers. "Every detail," Josephine said. "I was so scared. I thought I would have to leave Bodie with nothing, nowhere to go, and then you stepped in front of that crowd." "I took one look at you and knew," Marcus said. "I could not have explained it then, but I knew you were supposed to be part of my life." "They said I brought bad luck," Josephine mused. "Everywhere I went, disaster followed. But the truth was, I was just a woman trying to survive in a world that wanted someone to blame for its troubles." "And you survived," Marcus said. "More than that, you thrived. You built a life and a family. You turned a lonely cabin into a home. You brought nothing but good to everyone who knows you." Josephine smiled up at her husband, this mountain man who had seen past superstition and fear to the woman underneath. "We built it together. Everything we have, we made side by side." They stood together in the meadow, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their love story, and Marcus pulled Josephine into his arms. Even after all these years, his embrace made her feel safe and cherished and home. "I love you," he said, the words as true as the day he first spoke them. "You are the best luck that ever happened to me." "And you are mine," Josephine replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. They lived for many more years in their mountain home, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. When Marcus finally passed at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Josephine beside him. She mourned him deeply but without regret, knowing they had lived a full and beautiful life together. Josephine stayed in the cabin for another 5 years, tended by her loving family. She spent her days in the garden, on the porch watching the mountains, and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about their great-grandfather, the mountain man who had not believed in bad luck, only in love. When her time came, she went peacefully, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch with the sunset painting the mountains gold. Her last thought was of Marcus, and how a woman everyone said was cursed had found the greatest blessing imaginable in the strong arms of a man who saw her for who she truly was. The family kept the cabin as a gathering place for generations, a reminder of Marcus and Josephine's love and the life they built together. And when people told the story of the woman who came to Bodie bringing bad luck, there was always someone in the family ready to correct them. "She did not bring bad luck," they would say. "She brought the best luck. She brought love and family and showed that what others see as a curse can become the greatest blessing when met with courage and an open heart." And in the mountains above Bodie, where wildflowers still bloomed every spring and the stream still ran clear and cold, the cabin stood as testament to a love that had defied superstition and prejudice to build something lasting and true. Marcus and Josephine's story became legend, not as a tale of bad luck, but as proof that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary lives. The town of Bodie itself eventually faded, as so many gold rush towns did, but the legacy of the mountain man and the woman he loved endured. Their descendants spread across the West, carrying with them the values of hard work, fierce love, and the understanding that luck has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the choices we make and the people we choose to love. In the end, Josephine Voss Nash was remembered not as a woman who brought disaster, but as a woman who brought life and love to a lonely mountain and to the heart of a man who had been waiting for her without knowing it. And Marcus Nash was remembered not just as a mountain man, but as a man who had the wisdom to see beyond fear and rumor to the truth of a woman's character. Their love story was simple in many ways, a tale of two people who found each other against the odds and built a life together in the wilderness. But it was also profound, a reminder that the greatest luck we can have is to find someone who sees us truly, loves us completely, and stands beside us through all the seasons of life. And so the story ends where it began, in the high country of California, where the mountains still stand eternal, and the memory of true love lingers like wildflower perfume on the summer wind. Marcus and Josephine had found each other in a moment of crisis and built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. They proved that luck, good or bad, is often nothing more than perception, and that the only curse worth fearing is the curse of never taking the chance on love when it presents itself. In the meadow where Marcus had picked wildflowers for Josephine, purple lupine still bloomed every spring. In the cabin where they had raised their children, their great-great-grandchildren still gathered to hear stories of the mountain man and his beloved wife. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines, you could almost hear the echo of their laughter, the ghost of their love still blessing the land they had called home. The people of Bodie had been wrong about Josephine Voss. She had not brought bad luck. She had brought exactly what Marcus Nash needed most, a partner brave enough to face the wilderness, strong enough to build a life from nothing, and loving enough to turn a solitary existence into a legacy of family and joy. And he had given her what she needed too, a place where she could stop running, a love that asked nothing but her true self, and the understanding that she had never been cursed, only unmet by people worthy of knowing her. Theirs was a love story for the ages, carved into mountain stone and written in the lines of their descendants' faces, a testament to the power of seeing past surface judgments to the truth underneath, and to the transformative magic of love freely given and gratefully received. From that dusty street in Bodie where a mob had gathered and a mountain man had stepped forward, to the peaceful meadow where they had spent their final years together, Marcus and Josephine had walked hand in hand through life, proving that sometimes the best luck comes disguised as the worst, and that love, true love, can turn any curse into the greatest blessing imaginable.